Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, in light of impermanence and emptiness, is it possible to really know anything?
Interesting question. I doubt it's possible even before considering impermanence and emptiness. With them, no, at least for the unenlightened.
You're probably right about that. However, it is important to remember that emptiness does not deny or reject the world before our very eyes. It simply argues that that world has a specific nature, and that nature is empty of permanent existence.
Exactly. The same can be said of impermanence. It does not argue that the world is nothing but random chaos. It argues instead that all things are dependent on causes and conditions, and there is relative continuity in this causality.
Precisely. I suppose the task is then to know the world through unknowing our conventional and diluted perspective of it.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing unknowing in Buddhism. What is unknowing in Buddhism? Is it the same as agnosticism? What is its relationship to faith? We hope you enjoy. So, what is unknowing in Buddhism?
Unknowing is a concept in Buddhism pedagogy. For those that may not have heard this word before, pedagogy refers collectively to the various methods of teaching something. Buddhism pedagogy thus refers to how to teach Buddhism, either in a monastic context or in an academic context. It is important that you know that it's a pedagogical term because unknowing is not something that is explicitly stated in a one-to-one translatable form in any of the Buddhist texts. There is no Sanskrit or Pali word that we can point to and say that it captures what we're talking about here. However, it has a couple of very broad meanings. It refers to the process of unlearning things, such as false or limited beliefs about the world, or mental and emotional habits you may have in relation to certain stimuli. And on the other hand, it also refers to a state of being that calls back to something that we've talked about before, which is having your beliefs but not really believing them. Remember that intellectual knowledge, calculative and discriminatory thinking, and believing things in your phenomenal world to be capital T true is sometimes counterproductive to Dharma practice. As a result, unknowing is a matter of knowing everything that you know to be true is only true in a conditional or a provisional sense. Just recently we talked about knowing the sky is blue. That the sky appears to us as blue is conditional on the positions of the sun and the earth, your position on the earth itself, and the capacity of your eyes to perceive light. Thus the sky is only conditionally blue. Now let's talk about a methodological concern really quickly. It can be dangerous when Buddhism scholars come to interpretive conclusions like these, especially scholars from the West. These sorts of conclusions can be biased or agenda-based or otherwise subjective or limited in scope. It was through a series of such interpretive conclusions that we ended up with secular Buddhism, whose problems we have discussed previously. So, what's different about unknowing? Put simply, consensus. This isn't a flawless interpretive concept, but it is a very useful one, and a ubiquitous theme, especially in academia about Buddhism. Concepts and frameworks for understanding and making sense of things are never flawless, but are varying degrees of useful for understanding and unpacking what's going on in the texts. Because of the ubiquity of critiques of calculative and discriminatory thinking and truth absolutism in the Buddhist texts, this category of unknowing makes a lot of sense. Similarly, the practice of fundamentally shifting one's view of the world from a place of delusion to a place of knowledge and insight also strengthens this conceptual framework. So, we mentioned that interpretations and conceptual frameworks are held to a standard of usefulness more so than being held to a standard of being flawless and unfalsifiable. What happens when you use and apply the concept of unknowing? Very interesting things, in fact. First and foremost, it highlights a very important theme in Buddhism, that states of being are all processes, and processes are all states of being. In other words, unknowing is a verb and a noun. It refers to mindful awareness and insight into the nature of one's own knowledge, and it also refers to the process of building up and completing that awareness and insight. Next, it points at other important themes in Buddhism, such as the fact that there is an important gap between knowledge and insight. We've touched on this before, but it is possible to know a lot of stuff about Buddhism, but not really fully internalize it. Knowing about it is certainly better than not knowing about it, but knowing about it is not enough to complete your insight. Insight in Buddhism is a combination of knowledge and practice, a reflection of living differently because you know better. If one has insight, then because one understands things like emptiness and impermanence and dukkha, they necessarily act compassionately, kindly, and salvifically. One thing I want to mention about unknowing here is that it also points to the fact that Buddhism favors a degree of flexibility and relativism when it comes to one's beliefs, opinions, and notions about the world around them. Unknowing is similar in this case to something like non-attachment. Unknowing falls between one extreme of knowing something and believing it to be capital T absolute truth, and the other extreme of doubting anything and everything in every sense. It is understanding stuff in everyday life and conventional contexts, but also knowing that those things that you feel like you know are conditional, impermanent, empty, etc., and being able to adjust as needed. The standard by which you come to your own opinions and conclusions about things is about what is provisionally true in context and what leads most beings to enlightenment and to the Dharma. It is almost utilitarian in that sense. Utilitarian philosophy is the moral code of doing what helps the most people and hurts the least. But in this case, the definition of what helps the most people is leading them to the Dharma. All other pillars of belief and opinion are transient and change easily.
As far as unknowing not really being present in the text, it's not present directly, but it's also very clearly there from reading them. You can, even if they don't explicitly say the word unknowing, there is a process of deconstructing reality that comes with this. It's where we get Zen sickness from. That process and that state. Like you said, there's no direct scriptural evidence, but it's also observably there.
I agree, and that's why I think that it's a very useful category or interpretive term for understanding what's going on in the texts, at least in the Western context.
So, is unknowing the same as agnosticism?
This is an interesting and perhaps difficult question. Let's start by defining agnosticism and then move from there. The root word in agnostic is gnosis, or knowledge or awareness of the divine. This word can refer totally to all of a person's knowledge of the divine, or it can refer to a specific one-time revelation of the divine. It first comes up in the pre-Christian Greek world, and then comes to be used in the Christian context later on. The word agnostic has the prefix a, meaning non or not. So, agnosticism is the lack of divine knowledge or awareness, or the absence of revelation. In the Christian context, revelation is when God reveals himself to you, and so agnosticism means God has not revealed himself to you. Additionally, it can also be regarded as a rejection of the concept of gnosis, arguing instead that divine, the origins and end of the universe, what happens when we die, and all of these other things are entirely all unknowable. As a result, it is the absence of belief or knowledge of the divine, but it comes with a qualifier. That qualifier is that agnosticism does not outright reject the idea or the possibility of the divine. It simply regards the divine as being unknown, or, in some cases, unknowable.
I've always just described agnosticism as admitting ignorance. I don't know, I can't know, moving on.
Exactly right. And so in that sense, then all of this divine knowledge that we're talking about, the origins and the ends of the universe and what happens when we die, that would fall under the category of unknowable for you, because those things are just simply beyond the scope of the capacity of human knowledge. So, what is the relationship, if there is one, between unknowing in Buddhism and agnosticism? Well, agnosticism does frequently regard the divine, ultimate truth, ultimate reality, etc. as being unknowable to human beings, and unknowing actually operates according to the opposite principle. The idea is that one can come to the knowledge that everything they know is subject to causes and conditions because the Dharma is knowable and is reachable by human beings, and all sentient beings in general. However, when it comes to questions like the origins and endings of the universe, Buddhism and agnosticism are both famously uncertain. Buddhism has arguments about the fundamental nature of the universe, and it has arguments about what happens when you die, unlike agnosticism, but neither Buddhism nor agnosticism has a creation story or an apocalypse story. Buddhism also has a concept of revelation, unlike agnosticism, and that revelation is enlightenment. Enlightenment as a continual state of being or as an emergent event can both be regarded as revelation of divine knowledge because it implies the attainment of omniscience. And so this idea and the possibility of the idea is doubted or regarded with uncertainty in agnosticism. In this way, the reticence to talk about absolute truth and about the origins of the universe are shared between the two, but Buddhism is a religion, and agnosticism is not. Buddhism has revelation, and it has ultimate truth, and it has a narrative as to what happens when you die. Agnosticism is not a religion, but more of a way of interpreting life. Now, importantly, I see talk of Christian agnosticism, Buddhist agnosticism, and other religious agnosticism out there, and that is very dicey. First off, any form of religious agnosticism is an oxymoron on its face, and requires some clarification. The most common clarification I have heard is that you can take the moral arguments and the tenets about being a good person, but leave out the divine stuff. If you want to say that you believe what a given religion has to say about being nice and being a good person, but you hesitate to believe arguments about God or ultimate reality, that's fine, but you have to be really careful. This is part of the process by which secular Buddhism came to be. Basically, the critical mistake in being a religious agnostic or a secular Buddhist is thinking that you can pick and choose stuff out of a religion and decide that those things are the core or essential things about the religion in general. You can always decide what is most important to you personally, but when you start to claim that something that you have removed from its context is reflective of some core or essential nature about the religion in question, and nothing else is part of the quote-unquote true version of that religion, that's when you start to be wrong. Imagine I said that the core essential component of Christianity is following the third commandment, which is not working on Sundays, but all that mess about God, Jesus, heaven, hell, prayer, and the rest is all superstitious nonsense. That is very blatantly incorrect to say and justifiably offensive to Christians. On the other hand, if you say that you like observing the golden rule, but you can't be sure that God, heaven, or hell exist, that's not hurting anybody, and it doesn't fall victim to any of the misunderstandings or misrepresentations of Christianity that I just mentioned. Similarly, in Buddhism, if you believe in being compassionate, but you can't be sure about enlightenment, that's fine, and it's free of internal contradiction as long as you are actually being compassionate.
What is unknowing's relationship to faith?
This is also a complicated question. Let's mention the types of faith that we have discussed before, and then we can discuss how unknowing relates to them. There are far more types of faith than just these two, but we should stick with these two that we're familiar with. We've talked about the idea of faith as the willful assertion that something is the case in the total absence of evidence, or even in spite of evidence to the contrary. This can be called blind faith.
You could also call this reality-denying faith, especially when we're referring to faith that denies clear evidence in front of the eyes.
This is like going around saying 2 + 2 = 5 when it most definitely equals 4. When somebody asks, why do you say it equals 5? You just say in response, I just have faith that it does. Or, that's just the way I look at the world, and 2 + 2 = 4 is how you look at it. That is a particularly hyperbolic example, but this problem pervades among many religious people in many different contexts all across the world.
This is the brand of faith that gets us an unironic statue of Jesus riding a T-Rex.
However, if we are to be scholars about it, the truth is that very few, if any, religious traditions advocate for this type of faith in their scriptures. For example, as we'll talk about in the upcoming Pure Land Buddhism episode, the Pure Land texts don't say that the practitioner must have a reality-denying faith that Amida will save them and deliver them to the Pure Land when they die. In fact, they say that faith in Amida is a direct causal result of his actions as a bodhisattva, and these actions as a bodhisattva will lead you to be saved by him and reborn in his Pure Land. Similarly, the Bible does not say that you must have reality-denying faith in God and in Christianity. Instead, it says that the proof doesn't look the way that other ways of thinking might make you think it does. So, the problem is not the religions themselves. The problem is, in fact, with people expressing reality-denying faith and looking to religion for support. When they do that, they're misunderstanding and misrepresenting the religion, and they're often saying something blatantly false about the world around us. That sort of faith, that way of thinking about the world, does not lend itself to this model of unknowing that I've presented in any way, but that's because it doesn't really lend itself to anything. It's more of a compulsion than anything else.
We've been dancing around this in previous episodes, and I think this definition helps us close that gap.
This type of faith is rare in Buddhism if it exists at all. The more common type of faith in Buddhism is the trust that something that you have seen take place will take place again, given similar causes and conditions. For example, imagine that a person with a calculator has told you that 378 times 621 equals 234,738. And you don't have a calculator, and you haven't done the math yourself, but you can trust that this is the case nonetheless, and so you base further assumptions about the world around you on that assumption. This faith is much more common in Buddhism, and much more relevant to the discussion of faith and unknowing. This could be sort of called trust or entrustment as well. However, we will still discuss both types of faith in the context of unknowing. In the matter of blind faith, unknowing immediately starts to feel problematic. A primary reason why is that unknowing prompts you to unknow phenomenal reality and come to know ultimate reality. However, if you are blindly faithful about what ultimate reality is, then you're left deeply in the dark. What do you substitute in place of phenomenal emergent reality when you unknow all that stuff? In the event that your faith is blind, you are left waiting for whatever you're blindly faithful is about to happen. Here's a concrete example. Imagine for a moment that you are blindly faithful about your idea of capital G God. You have no concrete evidence, no gnosis, no reason to believe that this God is real beyond your own faith. Imagine that at the same time you believe that you will immediately achieve unity or oneness with your idea of God when you unknow everything about your phenomenal reality. This moment that you do this could be the moment of your death, or it could be when you realize the true nature of the world around you as you believe it to be. So you unknow everything. You shift your perspective on phenomenal reality to reflect knowledge that it is not as it seems in some way. If you do this, you're left hanging. You're left waiting for your idea of God to reveal itself to you or to achieve oneness or unity with you. This is not good, especially if that moment you're waiting for never comes. This is a very important hypothetical and a very important reason why blind faith is not frequently implicated in Buddhism. Blind faith is too dangerous, it's too big of an ask, and it's too unverifiable and ungraspable for the Buddha.
I have an alternate idea of how blind faith and unknowing would interact. Turning the ideas over in my head, it seems like the problem is more that the mechanisms they operate on are mutually exclusive, and combining both will result in one or the other simply failing. In a theoretical situation where someone with blind faith in something tries to undergo unknowing, I see three possible results. First, if the thing held in blind faith is false, and the unknowing process succeeds, then in the process, the foundations and details around that faith are churned so much that whatever was held in blind faith must either be disproven and that faith discarded, or that faith should be significantly altered by the process, which means it was not immutable in the first place. Alternatively, if the thing held in blind faith is false, and instead blind faith succeeds, then there is a portion of the unknowing process that is left incomplete. The portion of the world that are around and of that aspect of blind faith have not been unknown. That means the job's not done, and from the Buddhist perspective, anything that comes after that is based on flawed foundations. The last possibility is that the thing held in blind faith is true, which would mean the unknowing process wouldn't touch it because it's correct. From the Buddhist perspective, the only way that's really possible is if the thing held in blind faith is the complete Dharma. And that's Buddhahood anyway, isn't it? Also, if your faith is in the complete and correct Dharma, that faith can't be blind because, as we were saying, the primary factor that turns faith blind is denying reality. And if your faith is in the complete Dharma, then that is reality. You're not denying anything.
Now let's talk about the other kind of faith and unknowing. This kind of faith, or trust, can serve as a motivation for unknowing. When one undergoes the unknowing process, the cultivation of the great doubt, it can be very scary and daunting. We talked about Zen sickness before, and it absolutely applies here to make clear just how much of a symbolic death it is to actually come to unknow the world around you. Thus, Trust or faith that unknowing will lead to enlightenment is one of the most clear and obvious motivators on that path. Scary as it is, the endpoint is nirvana. It is the total defeat of desire, and therefore the defeat of dukkha. Thus, unknowing represents a very useful lens for understanding and interpreting Buddhist texts, practices, and themes. We have made use of it a lot on the show, but we haven't specifically made mention of it in such a discrete term as unknowing, like we've done here. Keep this framework in mind while reading, and also keep in mind that this is not the only framework, and that other texts will lend themselves more to the application of different ones.
While preparing for this episode, Nick told me that he had in mind us having a section. Nick told me that he had something that was intended as a prompt that would lead to a debate between us. There is one point of contention that I want to bring up before we close out. One statement that I would quibble with in the script, and so I'll repeat it here for clarity. The more common type of faith in Buddhism is the trust that something that you have seen take place will take place again given similar causes and conditions. So that was the statement, and my reply is, as I have always understood the word, calling that faith is semantically incorrect. Observing similar causes and conditions leading to similar results is gathering evidence, and belief formed on that are based on trust, not faith. So, my standpoint is a very rational, physical world-based one, and there is one point of faith, of genuine faith, required to hold up that worldview, as I've always understood it at least. And that's taking it on faith that our senses, or sensors in the case of experiments, are reacting to things that actually exist, that are behaving according to rules. This assumption may be incorrect. You or I could actually be a brain in the jar, bodies hooked up to the matrix, bits in a simulation, or figments of some fiction author's imagination. All of my senses could be feeding me bad information, and proving that one way or the other is essentially impossible. This is agnosticism. I don't know. So, for the purposes of being able to function in the world, I take it on faith that my senses and sensors are perceiving something real, and then things that come out of that are built on top of that fundamental faithful assumption. If this fundamental uncertainty means that everything that follows is also a matter of faith, then the word faith describes all knowledge, at which point I'm not sure it's a useful word anymore.
This is a really good point. Faith as a word is actually definitely incredibly vague and difficult to talk about meaningfully. In the Buddhist scheme, it's actually true that faith describes all knowledge. Oftentimes, faith is cast as the opposite of delusion. So delusion is the state where we think that we have an everlasting soul, and the opposite state is faith, that in light of the facts of impermanence and emptiness and dukkha, and all of our bad karma, we still have a chance at reaching enlightenment. This is a very tough binary for us to wrap our heads around because people who believe in science typically think of faith as being a state of delusion in itself. They think that it's deluded to believe something to be true despite a complete lack of tangible evidence or even despite evidence to the contrary. These are the same assumptions that you brought up before. They assume that their senses and sensors are working properly, feeding them proper information, and base other assumptions based on that one. The Buddhist textual response to this issue would be to say, just as you mentioned earlier, faith as it is described in Buddhism is more akin to the English word trust. In this sense, delusion is believing we have a soul, and faith or trust is the state in which we know that as long as we know and understand the Four Noble Truths and the 3 Dharma seals, we'll be fine. Because that is a step on the path to enlightenment that we can never go back from. Once somebody understands that stuff, once somebody perceives the existence of the Dharma, it is argued in Buddhism that they cannot unknow that. Only things that are deluded or otherwise conditionally true can be unknown. The Dharma cannot necessarily be unknown because it is... the Dharma necessarily cannot be unknown because it is the substrate of reality. I suppose you could know the Dharma and reject it, making you an Achantika, but you still know the Dharma in that case. And the argument is that once you know it, you will know it for every subsequent rebirth. The Sanskrit word we're using here for faith or trust is shraddha, and we've used it before. And Christians were the ones translating this word into English, and so naturally they translated it into faith as a one-to-one translation, when doing so might not have been the very best choice. However, this translation is only, I would say, like 80% wrong. The 20% where it is right is that it's possible to pursue the Dharma or the path of enlightenment even if you, 1, don't know about it, or 2, haven't decided if you reject it or not. The path of enlightenment is the path of realizing the Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, and 3 Dharma seals. It has nothing explicitly to do with knowing the Buddha or reading all the texts. The Buddha is there in part to inspire faith that this is how the world is and how the world works, but remember that he didn't make up the teachings or the Dharma. He just perceived them and communicated them to us skillfully. They are allegedly true regardless of him. I should say the Dharma. The Dharma is allegedly true regardless of him. You can theoretically reach enlightenment without any instruction or knowledge about the Buddha or the texts. That's called a Pratyekya Buddha, which we've talked about before. Similarly, if you have encountered the texts or the Buddha, you can still be on the fence about him or the texts and still advance on the path.
Which I find nice, no particular reason.
In Buddhism, you are invited to try this out and see, whereas in other major religions, even ones that strongly value debate and discussion, you're in or you're out. You either buy all in or you don't. There's no free trial, there's no test drive, there's no floor model. In Buddhism, because the Dharma is the nature and state of reality as it is regardless of the Buddha, you are said to be involved with it, regardless of your involvement with the Buddha.
I can easily buy that there's a linguistic mismatch at the root of how we've been circling each other over the term faith. I think at the core of this is the same problem with drawing lines along secular/religious lines, which we discussed in the secular Buddhism episodes. We can quibble about the exact semantics all day. For example, there are certain doctrines that I've seen in this show that I can point to and say, that's a doctrine based on trust, whereas others I'd say that's a doctrine based on faith. But I suspect the Buddha would say that I'm making a pretty serious error there, and even then, we for sure spend enough time talking about it in this episode. So, perhaps we can continue this discussion next week.
I agree completely. This will get ever more complicated as we dive further into Pure Land Buddhism and faith in our next episode. So, we hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of unknowing in Buddhism. Join us next week where we'll be discussing the parallels between Pure Land Buddhism and Christianity. It's hard not to notice that Pure Land Buddhism has some similarities to Christianity. Why is that? What are the doctrinal similarities between Pure Land and Christianity? What are the differences? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.